Danielle, welcome. Darlene, welcome. Hi, Jen. Hi, Jeremy. Let's see, we got Laura, Scott, Steve, Tanoa. All right, we've got a great group today.
Yeah.
A lot of people want to know about all this ransomware stuff that's going on.
It's
All
almost
right.
as if like this ransomware thing is some kind of big deal.
Exactly. All right, I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. My name is Jill Rose. I am your moderator and your webinar organizer. And as always, we just have a few housekeeping tips before we get started. We've put everyone on mute just to cut down any background noise. So if you do have any questions, there's a question box. Feel free to type out your question there. We also will open up for Q&A at the end of the session. With that, I'm going to go ahead and kick things over to Ben Schmerler. He is our Director of Strategic Operations. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jill. Thanks everybody for attending. As always, we welcome your questions and feedback, so please feel free as we go through this. This month, we wanted to just talk about ransomware, the new reality. In the past, we've certainly talked about the subject, and we plan on discussing it further. However, I wanted to talk this month sort of about the ramifications of the current environment when it pertains to ransomware. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about trends and approach and what you need to think about this year. All right, give me a sec. Why isn't it proceeding? There we go. All right, so just brief introduction. So I think we're all aware that ransomware is something that's becoming a greater threat from a variety of actors. These issues, when you hear about stuff that happened, for example, in the city of Baltimore, some of these people are honestly just trying to make money. But now we're starting to see criminals get involved. We're seeing geopolitical actors, people who are either acting on behalf of a state or perhaps terrorists or others who have an interest in disrupting order of things utilizing ransomware. So basically today, what I want to talk about is sort of the broader ramifications and the cascading effects and things we need to think about moving forward. So we'll get into that as we go. So our agenda today, how much of a threat is out there? Let's actually talk about the scale of the threat and where we stand so we can have some sort of a reality check on that. Why is this getting worse? So why is ransomware in 2020? We have all of these security tools. We have more sophisticated technology than ever. Why are we seeing more and more ransomware attacks? Why are we reading about it in the news? What's causing this? We're going to take a brief look at some of the recent ransomware incidents and maybe some takeaways and some lessons from it. We're going to talk about the impact on regulation and law. I am sure many of the people on the line have to be compliant with some sort of security measure or data privacy law. But I think we need to be thinking even broader here because we're going to start seeing the compliance rules and regulations speak specifically to the areas addressed from ransomware. You saw this sort of in 2019 when all of a sudden a lot of the compliance standards started asking about multi-factor authentication. And the reason is we were starting to see a lot of credential compromises and things like that. And as such, the regulations changed, in particular PCI. Anyway, the other thing we're going to talk about is sort of how should you change? How should your organization evolve? And what should you be thinking about differently now as a result of the current ransomware landscape? So in terms of the breadth of ransomware, as you see the little bad guy behind the chart, by 2021, according to this group, Cybersecurity Ventures, a new organization will fall victim to ransomware every 11 seconds, which is a remarkable thing. They also estimated that the ransomware damages will exceed $8 billion in total cost in 2021. In 2019, the estimated number for ransomware victims in terms of organizations was 1 every 14 seconds. So it's getting worse, unfortunately. Attacks on healthcare organizations are predicted to quadruple from 2018 to 2020 this year. Probably because healthcare is a particularly vulnerable area. They have a lot of data at stake. They tend to be oftentimes smaller businesses that are maybe have a harder time adjusting to these attacks. The FBI believes that ransom payments in the last year totaled $1 billion. That's just ransomware payments. We're not talking about total costs of remediation. We're just talking about payments to bad guys for infecting them. And I want to talk a little bit about that concept further, paying the ransom, as we go along. Over 90% of IT professionals had clients that suffered ransomware attacks in the past year, and that is from Datto. Some of you may utilize Datto products. They specialize in backup and disaster recovery. They have some other IT products as well. As an IT professional, I would say that number seems pretty accurate to me. It's sort of impossible to avoid ransomware attacks. We're swimming with the sharks right now. According to Kaspersky, 17% of the people who pay the ransom never even get their data back. So if we extrapolate that, let's say 17% of $1 billion is $170 million. That means $170 million was spent ostensibly on nothing, just money that was spent to get no data back. So paying the ransom doesn't even necessarily solve your issue. In 2017, Symantec identified 350 new variants of ransomware from the previous year. Now, that's what they know. As a matter of fact, before we started the call this morning, Jill sent me an article outlining another ransomware variant that I will probably be posting on in our social media and blog and such, because this is just another example of something to be aware of. So this is changing and evolving. If you want to consider ransomware just another virus, just like regular viruses, they evolve and change and mutate, if you will. And so expect that to continue with ransomware. Why is this getting worse? There's an increased reliance on data. So, I mean, if you think about where we're at in 2020, every business seems to be utilizing some kind of database that contains client information or controls their operation or their scheduling or how they bill or et cetera. And so now it's almost like taking your employees hostage in a way, because the people who operate and do the things that are necessary for your business to operate, to make money, to provide services to your clients, or if you're a nonprofit, to your targets, these technology services are central. We're kind of paralyzed if we don't have them. So as a result, this is a very effective attack because they know that they have an active audience. Email is still the most popular delivery method. It is extremely cheap and open. Getting an email account to send ransomware variants is trivial. It's an open system, right? If you think about a mailbox logically, a mailbox is designed to receive things, and you have a spam filter that can potentially block some of this stuff, but inevitably, when you consider the numbers game with spam, things are going to get through, or people are going to click something in their quarantine. So it's extremely easy to do, and it really doesn't take much. It's so easy to do that, in fact, you can buy kits. So I call it like arts and crafts, but criminal. Somebody with the know-how can go out there and buy easy tool sets that will allow them to become a ransomware criminal today and start making money. And if you are in perhaps a country where enforcement is lax and this stuff is pervasive, you could basically exist and create a career out of scamming people with ransomware. Attitudes towards security and data protections are very mixed. Many organizations are just simply too relaxed, and as long as they're vulnerable targets, this will continue. So many organizations, I feel, have poor technical controls and bad IT governance, including poor roadmaps and budgets. I think when we get into some of the specific attacks and incidents later in the webinar, we will see some of that, which is that one thing that's really common is that people haven't really planned for this. A lot of organizations have been looking at IT and security as a cost rather than an investment. We've gotten to the point with technology where I feel like if we're looking at the expenses of putting in proactive security measures or user training or what have you as this big cost, then we're not really looking at it the right way, because I mentioned earlier, IT professionals have said, and 90% of them have said that they've seen a ransomware attack in the past year. So it's really not a question of whether you're a target or not. You have to have the defenses in place and the processes in place to do this. And a lot of organizations are still kind of burying their heads in the sands of this stuff, and an attitude that maybe 10 years ago was okay, but today is not aggressive enough. Poor technical controls and governance. So, the technical controls in place oftentimes are not adequate. They have not been evaluated. There has not been a regular assessment or review process. The process of deploying new equipment or decommissioning old equipment is lacking. And so when you don't have a tight ship, the bad guys will exploit this. Again, it's a numbers game. So they're looking for the most vulnerable targets and they're going after them. And the good news for the criminal is that there is a huge market for them. Incident response plans are generally lacking. So one thing that's very common is that, and we hear this all the time, is what should I do if I'm the victim of a ransomware attack? And if you're asking that question, you really need to develop your plan, because really we need to have a process to recognize an attack, who we communicate with, what the role of our IT department or IT support company is, all of that stuff. And this should all be documented and communicated to users basically their very first day. We should have all of these things, the security culture aspects, the response plans, the communication procedures, really all in place for a user, and they should be communicated, and that should be a part of the culture before they start touching sensitive data. But the attitude from most organizations seems to be, hey, we hired this new person because we need them to accomplish this stuff. Let's get them operational. We got to get them trained so we can get them producing. And as a result, from a security culture perspective, they haven't achieved what they needed to be a responsible data custodian. And so we need to change that. Last, or not last, but definitely not least, is a willingness to pay. So, I mean, I mentioned that $1 billion in ransom was paid. Well, guess what? That's a lot of money. And if people are willing to pay the ransom, then there will be people who are willing to commit the crime. I was reading on LinkedIn yesterday, one of our partners posted a thing about New York is considering banning ransomware payments. And this is kind of a controversial approach, because a lot of people are saying, well, why, if I need my data back, why won't you allow me to pay to get my data back? But it's like we're creating bad incentives, right? It's not just whether or not we pay the ransom and get our stuff back, but we've just encouraged that person to go attack someone else. We've also encouraged a lack of compliance and security planning. Well, I can make the choice as an organization either to pay this ransom or set up a good security control measure. That the decision makers will often make the false choice of, well, the investment in paying ransom is cheaper than it is to develop comprehensive security. First of all, I don't think that's true. But second of all, that's really bad culturally. If every time we needed to do something responsible, we asked whether it was the right thing to do dollars and cents wise, we wouldn't do a lot of things that we should be doing. So I think we need to stop being willing to pay. And I applaud, personally, I think New York is doing the right thing by considering a ban on ransomware payments. Very limited accountability. So you do have a regulatory side where sometimes there is punishment and response for organizations that are not readily prepared. Sometimes not. Unlike a lot of crimes, it's kind of hard to get away with taking a minivan and driving up to a bank and robbing it. That's hard to get away with, right? The cops will catch you. There's alarms in place, et cetera. But I mean, if you were robbing that same bank digitally using ransomware, it's really hard for the authorities to get to you. The reality is that it's kind of a Wild West situation on the internet, and there's only so much we can do to catch bad guys who, by their nature, are designed to obscure themselves. So there's very limited accountability as it stands right now. So recent incidents, I want to talk about a few of these because I think that we can learn a lot from them. And maybe this is some scary stuff, but this is really a wake-up call. 22 Texas towns. So there was a single coordinated attack that went after the IT service provider's tools. So imagine, if you will, that DP Solutions was attacked and we didn't have our tools set up sufficiently. We didn't use the proper authentication methods, et cetera. I should point out while I talk about this that we, in fact, are very careful about these things, that we have set up procedures and such so that we are sure that it is our team who is working with sensitive data. But at any rate, this IT company in Texas didn't do that. They broke into the MSP's tools and affect all these towns. So they ended up paying $2.5 million in ransom and an estimated $12 million in recovery and mitigation costs. So a tremendous cost to these towns. This is a failure of not working with the right vendor, fundamentally, right? Vendors who talk a good game about security and management, but don't really have the real talk about it. Baltimore, I think this is obviously very close to home for a lot of us. This was hit by a ransomware called Robinhood. As you know, this really impacted everything in terms of the city's operations. So I know, for example, I'm on city water and I couldn't pay my water bill. You couldn't pay for traffic citations or perform real estate transactions. I had a buddy who was buying a new home and he couldn't get his title work done on his home, so his closing was delayed, which is very costly to him. The ransomware demand was $75,000, which the city did not pay. The overall cost was $18.2 million. You could debate whether maybe Baltimore should have paid it to get a recovery faster. Fundamentally speaking, and this, you can read all about this, and it hasn't been entirely transparent, but the city of Baltimore was really behind when it came to technology itself. We weren't budgeting enough for tech and for the security measures to protect it, and there was really poor planning and incident response. But the reality is that if you don't put the resources and planning and process in place, these sort of things are inevitable, and it's hard to blame individual IT people for something that is systemically wrong. Norsk Hydro. So this is, I got a European example here. So there's something called Locker Goga, which infected an aluminum provider in Oslo, Norway. This basically forced them to shut down production lines, and they had to go back to manual operations for reporting, billing, and other administrative tasks. So basically, they went entirely back to paper. I bring this up because the company itself has stated that this was the most significant operation challenge and financial loss in company history. That if you think about a company, an aluminum provider that's been around for a while, that is a big, successful company, that a single cybersecurity incident can be the biggest challenge to the company's entire existence really says something. It was a $60 to $70 million recovery cost estimated. So I don't think we've been given specifics on this, but the cost was tremendous. So I bring up this one because I want to make sure we're stating the stakes here and that we're putting it all out there. That a ransomware incident, if serious enough and not planned out well enough when it comes to backup, recovery, response, preventative stuff, et cetera, training, et cetera, is you could face a challenge to the very existence of your organization. It's that serious. All right, moving on. We'll talk about regulation and law real quick. And by the way, we are going to take Q&A at the end. So obviously, I'm not going to talk about every last thing about ransomware. So please feel free to consider your questions now when we get to the point. One thing that has really changed really over the past year, and it'll change in Maryland too, is expansion of mandatory data breach notification laws. One thing is GDPR, which is the European regulation. If you carry data on Europeans, they have the right to have reasonable protections on that. Communications, if that data is breached, the right to remove the data from your system if they feel that you shouldn't have it anymore, et cetera. Behind that is CCPA, which is California's law, very much in line with GDPR. I've heard some controversy. People don't necessarily like that, but I mean, I think the reality with a law like California's is that, or Europe's, is that we're going to get to the point with these regulations that even if you're not under the main jurisdiction, you probably have a customer or a data point that does, right? So I imagine people on this call have clients that are in California, that they have information on California individuals. So now you're subject to that law. Maryland, I know, in the General Assembly right now is debating several data privacy laws. I would expect something to hit Maryland soon. It will probably be very much in line with a lot of the other regulations. So my view has always been we should be creating a best practice, a good structure in place that's maybe focused around maybe NIST or something like that, and then use that as a baseline for planning in the future so that when we do face a specific regulation or law or rule, that we can just adjust to it. So I would just say in general, you're subject to a law whether you know it or not. There's been increased demands for risk assessments, attestation of security standards, vulnerability tests, and so on. So basically all of these oversight tasks, what's starting to happen is you might have business partners that start asking you, hey, what is your approach to cybersecurity? I mean, they should. If they're asking you to hold on to sensitive data, then and you be a data custodian, they should care about what happens with that data after it enters your organization. Just as you should care with your partners. You have to have a line drawn in the sand that says, this is what I'm doing with my data, this is how I care for it, how I plan around it, et cetera. And by the way, I'm giving this data to you now, and you're agreeing that you're responsible for this stuff. If nothing else, to cover yourself in case something bad happens on their end. Well, you know, my partner said that they had this great compliance system in place, and they had a great communication procedure, and blah, 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 blah. And then they breached it in, and I found out all that was false. Well, at least you had it on paper. At least you had it in writing. This is sort of a new thing. There's the Department of Homeland Security Cyber Hunt and Incident Response Teams Act of 2019. So the Department of Homeland Security has been given a budget now to maintain incident response teams to assist public-private entities with security issues, including ransomware. So I think a lot of this is discretionary. But I think you're going to start seeing maybe if there are major breaches, let's take for the sake of argument the Equifax breach. Obviously, this law did not exist before or during the Equifax breach, but I would imagine that they would have been on sort of boots on the ground in a situation like that. Maybe don't expect DHS in your small business, but start to expect the government to have a little bit more an official response to these attacks and being a part of that, which I think is probably a good thing. Some of these organizations really need the oversight and assistance. I mentioned this before, but there are calls for outlawing ransomware payments. And again, I saw the New York things just yesterday. I wrote this before I saw the New York thing because I think I saw another municipality debating it. I feel like this is probably going to happen at some point. So that sort of, loose chain, allowing people to encourage this is probably going to go away. We need to remove the incentives from people committing these attacks in order to see these attacks stop. So I'm generally for that, but I'm also for us having mandatory proactivity for security for people who carry sensitive data. So how do we adjust to this new reality for ransomware? What should we be doing as an organization? We need our incident response plans to our staff need to speak directly about ransomware response. We need to explain what ransomware is, what they might see, maybe show a little example. It's very easy to find screenshots, and talk about what manager they report to, how they report this to IT, encourage people not to hide this stuff, not to try and fix it themselves, that communication is critical to success recovering from ransomware. That's a very, very important thing. We need regular assessment plan as part of IT management. So really on probably an annual basis, one thing we do for our managed clients is we do quarterly business reviews where we sit down, and really we should be using that time to talk about where we're going, what the plans are. Whoops, why did that happen? Sorry about that. Using that time to talk about where are we going, what are our goals with IT, where is our data sitting, how do we need to adjust for the new reality, what were we doing in the past that made sense maybe in 2015, 2016, but in 2020 doesn't really work out for our organization anymore. And that includes some testing and maybe compliance review as well. We don't want to overthink it. We don't want to have to do assessments every month or something like that. But I think sitting down at least once a year with the stakeholders and saying, hey, what are we doing, where are we succeeding, and where can we improve when it comes to security and productivity with our IT is critical for management. And I can't think of a number of organizations that wait for these things, wait for there to be a problem before they actually start making plans to adjust. We really need to have strong backup and data management. If we have a ransomware attack and our organization's data is under the control of a bad guy, we need to know that we have a safety valve where we can say, you know what, we're not paying the ransom and we're going to do a recovery on our own. First of all, we might not legally be able to pay ransom much longer. So if we really care about that data, we need to be prepared to do a recovery. More importantly, good data recovery plans can and backups can make these ransomware incidents less painful. I'm not going to say not painful, but less painful than those who don't. Getting back to Datto, I know they have some excellent tools that can recover servers quite quickly. While you rebuild the server, you have sort of a baseline server. I mean, that's one way to approach it. Obviously, the solutions are going to vary based on your organization and what you do, but it's very, very important that we look at this. Patch management is essential. Most of these ransomware attacks are attacking vulnerabilities that are known. Oftentimes, they are within Microsoft Windows or, say, Adobe Reader or something like that. We need to be patching these applications regularly and staying on top of it. You may have seen the letter that I sent out to our clients, I want to say 2 weeks ago, where I talked about the Windows 7 end of life and the last big patch that happened to release on the day of it that the NSA discovered a flaw in Windows. Microsoft issued a critical patch. As always, for our patch management clients, this patch was applied to servers and workstations, including Windows 7. But in the future, those Windows 7 devices may not get those patches from Microsoft. So you need to have supportable devices and then a good system in place to make sure that those patches are applied. Oftentimes, when an actual patch management system is not utilized, patches are missed. In my days of vulnerability tests, it was very, very common that when I would do vulnerability tests, that the organizations that did not have patch management would routinely have more vulnerabilities, routinely. And it's not that they didn't have updates set, it's just that it didn't work entirely right or in a way that was managed. User rights and access management as part of design and maintenance. So when we are looking at our maintenance plans and our assessments, we need to make sure users have the right level of access. So let's say someone takes over an account and they're looking to compromise it. They need to have that compromise very much limited to something for that user. Same for access management. So we need to make sure that there are not too many accounts where we have more potential holes in the system. Depending on what you're doing and what your risk levels are and how we need to respond, you may need higher level monitoring and recovery tools than you're currently utilizing. For most of our clients, we utilize just system level monitoring. Is the server up? Is it running properly? Did it get its antivirus running? Things like that. Well, that's good. We should definitely do that stuff. But there are even more sophisticated and admittedly more expensive tools that will do things like log aggregation and manage detection and response, so that when an attack starts happening, that there's a security engineer watching these logs, noticing trends, and trying to stomp out the threat before it becomes a big problem. Obviously, this is an increased investment. It costs money. It takes resources. But if your risk is such that you can't face these long outages and downtime, maybe you need to step up your security monitoring stuff. It's not a fit for everybody. Sometimes you can't justify it. Sometimes it's not a great fit. But I think it's something that needs to be at least discussed. Training, training, training. I cannot tell you the number of organizations that have staff that are not aware of phishing, what phishing means, social engineering, what that means and how that impacts them, that they don't really understand what ransomware is or how you can get infected by it. They don't know the procedures. They don't know what malware is. I mean, there's just a lot, or the training is limited. Excuse me. And while I appreciate that people may be on the line trying to use this as like a security awareness thing, we need to have even more engagement on security awareness training for an entire staff. My message to our clients who engage in security awareness training is that ultimately we're trying to create a culture of security where staff is generally aware, they know who to communicate with, they know what the threats are, and when somebody new comes on and they are a new employee, and that new employee hasn't had the benefit of all that training, that they're sort of getting that herd immunity by working with their colleagues on subjects that they've got a lot of experience in. And so we're kind of building a culture of security as opposed to one-time trainings and sign off on this sheet where you said that you read the security outline. There has to be consistent engagement. Nothing too overwhelming. I mean, we should do small engagements regularly, but we should do some kind of training on issues. The investment in training, I know sometimes people say, well, why should I pay this? But if we can avoid one ransomware incident because we've created a training program that cost us money, I think at the end of the day, we're going to be a lot happier. So wrapping up real quick on the main content, ransomware is only going to continue to evolve. So we're going to see new delivery methods, higher ransoms, more areas of vulnerability, and more threat actors. These are all unpredictable things. We don't know how they're going to change. There's speculation that in light of some of the geopolitical issues right now with Iran, that what's to say that they don't have state actors or people around state actors utilize ransomware to try and attack American interests. That happened certainly with North Korea, where North Korea, that was the big Hollywood breach that happened a few years ago. I mean, that was a state actor. These things are kind of unpredictable, but we should keep open mind about it, unfortunately. The best way, and maybe this is the one takeaway that everybody should get out of this, is that the best way to protect your organization from the threat of ransomware is good governance of IT as a whole, starting with the people and policies all the way to specific technical products that accomplish risk management goals. So we need to have comprehensive security. And it doesn't mean that we buy every product or do everything or make every investment or do everything state of the art, but we have to govern it well. We have to know what our risks are. We need to know where our organization is really strong. We need to know what kind of data we need to protect, how it needs to be protected, all of that. And we should feel that we at least have a plan. And it doesn't mean that by having that plan, we're immune from issues or that we're never going to have an incident. But it does mean that we created a plan and we can live with the results. There has to be at least that kind of Zen moment. I've used the analogy before. You can buy a gym membership and you can eat healthy and you can go work out 6 times a week and have a personal trainer, and you can still have a heart attack at age 40, and that's unfortunate. But the more likely scenario is that by doing all of those responsible behaviors, having good governance of your own body, that you're going to have actually more positive health outcomes, and that's what's likely. I wouldn't say to somebody, well, you should have ate junk food and stopped exercising because you had an untimely heart attack. I would say that the odds are that if you do the right things, that your risks are lower and that you're going to have better outcomes. But you gotta put in the work. You can't just rest on your laurels. Anyway, that brings us to Q&A, and while Jill is getting some questions, I thought I'd preview our next webinar. So that's going to be February 26th, our last Wednesday of the month at 11 a.m. What we're going to talk about next month is identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, using the NIST cybersecurity framework to make smart decisions for your business. You can click on the link to register. Essentially, what we're going to talk about is NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, created a general framework. And rather than get into all the stuff, I want to talk about the 5 big areas. And the reason we're going to talk about it is that when you have to make decisions, it's going to be hard for you to know what identify technologies are important. But I want you to think about what identify actually means as it pertains to threats, just as an example, and sort of speak to that and give you guys the tools you need to ask the right questions of your vendors, to question your process, to question your policy, so that you can make good decisions when the time comes. Again, we aren't going to be able to make perfect decisions or have perfect outcomes every time, but we want to have a good plan in place that has some kind of framework, and NIST does a great job with it. And the really good news is that all these resources are free, and they give you a lot of tools and a lot of guidance and things that I think we really should be taking advantage of. So anyway, with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jill. Jill, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. Thank you. All right. First question is, I'm not
Jill,
exactly sure what is the fix.
I don't know if you got me on mute.
No, can you hear me now?
I'm still not hearing you. I don't know if that's me, maybe.
Okay, I can type you out the question.
That was weird. So now it's
So the
coming
question
out
is,
hold on. Sorry, one sec. I'm having a little audio issue on my end. Can you go now, Jill?
yes, can you hear me?
All right, great. Now it works. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, so the question is, what is the fix if you are a staff member receives ransomware other than payment?
Right. So let's say you have a machine that's locked down with ransomware. It beat your antivirus and malware protection. It got through. Maybe you patched everything up. You did everything right, and yet you still got ransomware. So what do you do? So it all depends on the situation. So if it's a server, ideally, we recover the server to another server. Maybe we use a appliance to restore from an image, and then we're just basically blowing the box away and recovering a fresh server without the ransomware on it. Similarly for PCs, you can blow away the encrypted hard drive, reload the image. Now, the thing that requires this is to have good backup and disaster recovery in place. You need the technology in place to be able to say, hey, we're just going to wipe these machines away and recover. And maybe we lose the data. Right now it's 11:39 a.m. Maybe we lose the data we worked on from 9 to 11:39 a.m. But we've got everything from before then, and we're in better shape. We've recovered it much better, and we didn't pay a ransom to somebody. By the way, if you pay that ransom, there's a very, very good chance that you get attacked again. There's statistics that suggest that if you pay a ransom, you're more likely to get more ransomware. So the proper response is to use your recovery solutions to fix these things.
Okay, great. Hopefully that answered the question. We have 2 more questions that came in. So what are your thoughts about saved passwords in web browsers, email systems such as Outlook?
Yeah, so saved passwords, it all depends. So it depends on the solution. So let's talk about browsers first. So let's say you're using Google Chrome, and Google Chrome has all of your passwords in it. Well, just remember that anybody who gets access to that Google Chrome session is going to be able to access all of those saved passwords. If you've locked down the account, the computer account, so that you can't actually log into that machine, unless you're the right user and maybe you have multi-factor authentication in place to make sure that that sort of vault of passwords is protected, you're probably in okay shape. However, there's another thing to consider, which is Google Chrome itself. What if, and this isn't really a what if, this is very plausible, Google Chrome has a flaw, and Google Chrome has a flaw that can be exploited by a third party, and perhaps they get access to all of your passwords and all your accounts. That's a flaw with Google Chrome, which speaks to an earlier point I made, which is that we have to have good patch management in place so that these tools that we use for convenience are secured properly. There's nothing wrong inherently with saving those passwords into trusted accounts and trusted devices, as long as the device itself is reasonably secured. Now, there may be regulations that prevent this in certain ways, and we'd have to look at that on a one-on-one basis. Other saved passwords, like Jill briefly mentioned, Outlook. So when you you're using Microsoft Outlook and you log in the first time and set up your email account, it's not like you're entering your password in every time. Again, this gets back to securing the device and securing authentication into Windows. If you're using Office 365, which most of you probably are, you can, if you're using multi-factor authentication on the Office 365 account or the Windows account, you've locked that down pretty well, and it makes it unlikely that somebody could break in, or less likely, I should say. Anyway, great. I think that's it. Whoever asked the question, if you want to elaborate on some specifics, you can reach out to me personally and we can talk about it. Jill, do you want to get to the next one?
Yes. How does a company pay for ransomware? Is this through an insurance policy?
How does a company pay for ransomware? So I would want to talk to a specific insurance guy to talk about it. So in the abstract, forget about insurance or not, typically ransomware is paid with cryptocurrency, Bitcoin and the like, because one consequence of cryptocurrency is that it's not easily traceable. If I write a check or run my credit card and pay for something, you can find out that I paid for it. It's pretty easy. Cryptocurrency has a lot more obscurity. That's one of the controversies of cryptocurrency, which is that it can be used for illicit acts because it's so hard to trace. Speaking to the other part of the question, which is, what if I have insurance? So cyber insurance often, and you'd want to speak to your insurance company about it, oftentimes they will have some kind of ransomware coverage where they will pay the ransom for you, or they will pay for your recovery to a certain point. That's part of the policy. But one thing that's very true about insurance, and this not just applies to cyber insurance, but every type of insurance, which is that not all cyber insurance is created equal. There are my friend Doug, who works for Travelers. He talks about in some of his talks all the various types of cyber insurance you can get and what parts of the policy should you include. And it probably wouldn't surprise you that many people purchase cyber insurance policies that aren't adequate, that don't address all of the costs or address some of the costs. So I would definitely encourage you to speak with your insurance company about it, find out exactly what would happen. But it's not something that's not thought of. Again, in the abstract, you're going to be using cryptocurrency to pay for it, but who pays it is a different story. And oftentimes the insurance companies, I believe, will pay those costs directly. So it's not like you're the one who's paying the crypto to the ransom guy. I think the insurance company often does. But again, it's going to depend.
Okay, great. Next question, should shared drives be password protected?
Should shared drives be password protected? Absolutely, in one form or another. So I'm going to talk about Microsoft Windows in general. Maybe this doesn't speak to the person's specific question. If so, we can talk about it a little later offline. When you log into Windows in an Active Directory environment, and let's say for the sake of argument that you have your shared drive is tied into that universe, you're already authenticated with the rights to your shared files defined by Windows Active Directory. So let me use an example to be a little more clear. So I'm Ben Schmerler. I log in B Schmerler with my password and my MFA to get into my account, and then I have access to our shared folders, and our shared folders have things that I'm allowed to access and things I'm not allowed to access. Those rules are determined by our system, and I can't, and somebody else can't. The only way someone else can have access to those files with my rights are if they break my password and my multi-factor authentication. That password into Windows, that Microsoft password, is sort of the gatekeeping key to get into the system. For the individual who asked this question specifically, if you want to talk about how it might apply to you, we probably need to have a conversation a little bit more in depth and a little more specific, and to see whether your authentication is appropriate. But there are ways to protect it in a reasonable way. But I would say yes. I mean, certainly if the shared folder and the shared data is important and is sensitive, we should make sure that A, the right people have the right rights to get into them, and B, that there's kind of protection of these things aren't open world. I'm going to bring up another example real quick, though. There's something called the ESA, the Electronic Software Association, I believe. The ESA is a video game trade group, and they run the conference E3. And last year, they had a breach of all these journalists' private data, and that breach happened because they had a shared file, a database, that was not hidden behind any kind of authentication, username, password, MFA, all that. It was put outside of that zone, and it didn't take much, but a hacker accessed it and shared the information on the internet, which led to a lot of harassment and things like that. You can read all about it. It's like the dumbest data breach in the universe because it's that's my scientific opinion. Because it was something that was basically like they broadcast sensitive information. So speaking to the question, this is something that's real, and so we should talk about it. Anything else, Jill? We're getting a lot of questions today.
Yeah, so far we have two more. So if you do save your passwords on Google Chrome, is it better to be signed into your Google account?
Yeah, but I would use multi-factor authentication into Google. Google does offer an authenticator application, or you can use like a third-party application with Google's authenticator. So you would have your personal Google account and your personal Google password, and then that third-party authentication. Because keep in mind that once you break that account, if you lock those or you align those passwords to that Google account, now they have access to everything. The same thing applies, by the way, to password management tools. I think I've talked about LastPass and other solutions in the past. We need to make sure that those vault accounts, if you will, are secured in and of themselves. So we're going to take the security on those a lot more seriously. One thing I've talked about in the past also as it pertains to authentication is we have to understand what's behind the door. So, it's hard to manage all these passwords and accounts. I think it's okay to take a little bit more cavalier approach to accounts that may not be the most sensitive to us in terms of what's behind them. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that you have a Twitter account, and that Twitter account you use because I follow, for example, a coupon Twitter thing. It shows me good deals on Amazon and stuff like that. Hey, today here's a deal on this. If somebody broke that account that I use just to track a bunch of Amazon deals, it doesn't really affect my day. My data is not breached. I have nothing in it. But on the other hand, my TurboTax account, where I file my taxes, has a lot of sensitive data in it, and I really care about what's behind it, and I really use good passwords and multi-factor authentication, all that stuff. So we should use security that aligns with the asset we care about. Any other questions, Jill? I think you mentioned we had one more.
We do. So as a client of DP Solutions, what type of support will be given in the event my company receives ransomware? Resolution steps, data recovery support, etc.
Obviously, it's going to depend on the agreement you have with us. If you have an account manager or client strategy advisor, this is a great thing to talk about specifically for them. I will say for our clients on Confidence Plus, We're not going to include ransomware recovery as a part of your solution. That's considered a project, but we will do the support. We take these things, as you might imagine, very seriously, and it may be difficult for us to resolve all the issues all at once. I mean, sometimes it's just a lot of work to recover this stuff, depending on what was in place, the nature of the infection, so on and so forth. But we make it very important to use all the resources and all the support we have to resolve these things. You know, we have to triage. We have, I think I was looking at our KPI board this morning. We have something like 6,300 endpoints that we're supporting right now. It's a ton of stuff. And it means that when somebody has a ransomware incident and they're a managed client who has that, you know, has the support agreement and the service level where we respond immediately, we're going to prioritize those responses over, say, a user who doesn't like the way their font looks in Microsoft Word. I mean, maybe not the best example of the type of tickets we want to take, but the point is that we have to make priorities, right? And the urgent issues that cause business interruptions, like ransomware, not exclusively ransomware, but like ransomware, we have to take a very aggressive approach on and give the most response and the most resources to. And it's a challenge for us as an IT services company. Honestly, the best approach to this stuff is not get infected with ransomware. I know it sounds silly and maybe cliche to get into, but if your primary concern is, well, DP Solutions is just going to fix it for us, I mean, yeah, we'll get you through it. I mean, we get our clients through these things. I want us to be in a position where we can be aggressive about avoiding this stuff. And I would rather, if we're going to spend the same dollars, I would rather us spend the dollars on the upfront prevention stuff to really minimize our risk than say, well, we've budgeted this year $50,000 or whatever it is. I'm just throwing something out there in labor costs to recover from security incidents. I mean, that just seems like we're keeping a bank of money to lose, and we're counting on being out. I want to be more positive. I want to be more aggressive than that when it comes to security stuff. Anything else, Jill?
No, those were all our questions.
All right, great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. This was a very lively one, which is really great. I really encourage the Q&A and the engagement. It's really appreciated. It makes things interesting for me. My contact information is on the screen still. I really encourage you all to join the next webinar. If you feel like you have maybe other people on your staff or maybe partners that you work with who you think maybe this will be useful information, please, by all means, this is open for all to attend. So check that out, and I look forward to seeing you all on February 26th.
And as a side note, I will be sending out a recording of today's webinar later today. So great. Look for that in your inboxes shortly.
Terrific. Thanks again, and have a great day, everyone.